I'm joined now by Congressman Khanna, who represents the 17th Congressional District of California. He was national co-chair of the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2020. If you don't know much about who he is and the combinations of things he stands for, his Twitter bio says Silicon Valley CA17, new economic patriotism and restoring American manufacturing, Medicare for all, ending endless wars, no PAC money. That should give you a pretty good idea of some of the things that, some of the different sides of who he is and what he's about. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Really an honor to be with you. And I appreciate a lot of things about you, but especially your teaching in Morehouse, which is a great American institution.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a deep cut. Thanks. So, Congressman, I know we've got limited time. I want to get right into it. Right now, things obviously are looking pretty grim. The Trump administration is, sending people to CCOD in El Salvador without due process. Legal permanent residents are being deported to their home countries for writing newspaper op-eds. We have this bizarre approach to tariffs that's causing all kinds of economic chaos, attacks on labor rights. I could go on and on and on. And I haven't even mentioned, the kind of real horrors that Trump has greenlit in Gaza. So I'm sure we agree the situation is really bad, right? It's authoritarianism, economic chaos, all of it. And I know you've spoken out about all these things, but what I really wanted to start by asking you is just the big question that I kind of want to hear from any elected Democrat, what their answer is to, which is how much responsibility do Democrats' failures bear for creating a situation where Trump could be voted back into power in the first place? And where are they falling short now and pushing back against this?
Well, there's a fair amount of responsibility with the Democratic Party as part of a failed status quo consensus over the last 40 years. NAFTA, China's ascension into the WTO without the appropriate guardrails, the hollowing out of factory towns across America, the rise in income inequality where we went from 53rd in the world to 128th without any action, the rise in the racial wealth gap where we allowed technology to flourish in my district, $12 trillion, but didn't really think about how Black and brown rural communities were going to participate in the modern economy. All of this set the stage for an enormous disgust and distrust of institutions. The American dream was seen as slipping away. Look, I'll give you one quick example. And Quentin in Milwaukee, where I just was, said to me that his uncle back in the 1960s in Milwaukee had a better life than economic hope than he thinks his kids will have. And his uncle was an African-American man in the 60s, in the Jim Crow era of this country, right? And so what were the economic failures of the party? I think we have to grapple with that. Now, what are we not doing enough? I think the party is finding its voice. It was kind of driftless for the first month and a half. Then Trump committed the cardinal sin. It was not violating the Constitution. It was not insurrection. It was not violating the rights of immigrants or even American citizens. It was destroying people's wealth and money. And suddenly everyone said, wow, this is a line too far. The bond market has spoken. The one check on Donald Trump is the bond market, not the courts, not the Congress, not the Senate. And I think that suddenly gave people a little bit more courage to start speaking out because they saw his numbers going down. But now you have a lot of people organizing across the country speaking out about the violation of immigrant rights and the attacks on universities. And more people are finding the courage given that they see him as weaker.
Yeah, so I want to talk about some of what that's looked like, and in particular, some of what you've seen. I mean, you just mentioned going to Milwaukee, and I know that you've been going to a lot of places around the country recently, and trying to go to places where you're not just going to sort of speak to people maybe that Democrats and progressives like usually speak to, and I wonder if you could maybe speak to some of what you're kind of trying to accomplish in doing that, and again, what your sense is of the overall shape of pushback to Trump now. I mean, right? Like in other words, I mean, I think a lot of the danger of the way people react to him can be that a lot of times a sense of doom and foreboding and thinking it's all over, and we've got this lurch towards authoritarianism that's irreversible is self-fulfilling, right? I mean, it makes people afraid to it makes people afraid to speak out in ways that they otherwise would have, and so I guess I am curious what your sense is right now of of where we're at with that, and like what you've kind of been seeing from people's reactions in these different places around the country you've been going to.
Well, it's self-fulfilling, weak, and self-indulgent. Our challenges as a generation pale in comparison to the challenges my grandfather had, who went to jail for 4 years alongside Gandhi fighting for Indian independence. They pale in comparison to what the civil rights movement had and people like John Lewis had, who were beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and who went to jail literally for civil rights. I mean, we're talking about partner for profits at law firms, maybe going from $6 million to $5 million, or members of Congress possibly having super PAC money spent against them. I mean, come on. I mean, let's have some sense of proportion. I mean, the question is, will we have the gumption to stand up against a guy who's incompetent, who surrounded himself with incompetence, and stand up for American democracy and have the confidence to say we're going to prevail and we're going to speak out and we're going to organize. And no, a country that overcame the Civil War and that won World War II and that defeated Jim Crow and defeated communism isn't going to lose democracy to Donald Trump and some of his billionaire incompetent buffoons are running the country. I mean, have some sense of confidence. And I think that is coming now. And we're seeing this organizing taking place in these districts where people are speaking out. I was in rural Nebraska, and I was so pleasantly surprised because I was there and I was giving my pitch that I thought would appeal to folks there. I said, look, Trump has cut $1 billion to farmers, and the farmers would use that money to give food to churches and to students and kids in need. And the questions that kept coming up is, what about Abrego? What about the violation of the Constitution? What about the judge in Wisconsin being put in jail? And I said, I love it. Rural Nebraska asking about the Constitution. And so I think the organizing spirit now is there, and there's much more confidence that this administration is going to be defeated.
Yeah, well, you were talking about going to rural Nebraska. On the other end from that, where I live now, right, when I was teaching at Morehouse, that was when I was obviously living in Atlanta. But where I live now is Los Angeles, and there was just this, fighting oligarchy rally there that you spoke at. And I am curious because to get your thoughts, because there's been some back and forth lately about the usefulness of that rhetoric about oligarchy, with people like Elisa Slotkin saying that it's not good messaging because, according to her, most Americans don't even know what oligarchy is. And I was just wondering, I mean, given your sense, I mean, kind of tying into what you were just talking about like what range of issues the people are concerned with. I mean, do you think that the oligarchy messaging hits?
Yes, it's basically saying that people who have wealth shouldn't be able to translate that into power, that you shouldn't be the richest person in the world and spend $250 million to get Trump back in the White House and then get the keys to make policy for all Americans. And part of the job of American leaders is not just to repeat what the public says, but to lead and to educate and to inspire. One of the great things, if you read Dr. King's speeches, I mean, sometimes I have to read them twice. I don't understand all of the allusions and the philosophy and the deep intellect. And the reason they stand the test of time is they do have words much more and thoughts much more complicated than oligarchy. Our country responds to leaders who elevate the public discourse, who try to teach us something in a non-condescending way to lead us to a better nation, whether that's a Frederick Douglass, whether it's a King, whether it's an Obama, whether it's what Bernie is doing. I don't think that we should embrace anti-intellectualism as the answer for the American people, especially because our greatest leaders. When you look at the best speeches of a Lincoln, an FDR, a Kennedy, a King, they're beautiful. And so why concede to Donald Trump that rhetoric in conversation only has to happen as in a locker room in a football game? Yeah, we should go and enjoy it, but that doesn't mean that that needs to become the standard for American public discourse.
Yeah, and I should point out too that there has been some polling on this, and a majority of Americans do know what oligarchy means, and even more interestingly, I think to your point about how you want leaders who can change the discourse, not just reflect it. When you give people in the same poll a explanation of what oligarchy means, and then you ask if they think that that fits the United States right now, then you have. So I think this is the second oligarchy poll here, right? So you have actually a large majority of Americans who do see that as a plausible concern about the United States. That it's at least somewhat an oligarchy. That's that's a fairly large majority. That's something like 3/5. Who say at least somewhat, which seems. I agree. I mean, shouldn't be that surprising given that we do have, the richest man in the world who sort of, was the largest, donor to the Trump campaign, or, to either side in the last election, who sort of made himself this strange position where he got to slash and burn his way through the federal budget. And in general, I mean, that, you have a situation where the wealthiest Americans are wealthy on a level that would have been sort of unfathomable, right? Even a generation or two ago. I mean, that people who work at Amazon are oftentimes in really bad labor conditions. You have people who are subject to electronic surveillance, so they end up like skipping bathroom breaks for fear of falling behind in their quota. But they're grateful to have those jobs. And the owner of Amazon literally owns his own spaceship. I mean, I think that's that level of economic inequality is one where is one where I actually think it would be weird if you didn't have a majority of the public, who said, yes, I think domination of society by a wealthy elite is a real concern right now.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. You get to work for the one of the wealthiest corporations in the world in human history, and you think that would be like winning the lottery, and you could have a good paying job, and you can't. You're subject to electronic surveillance. You're subject to long work hours and not good pay, and all the wealth is accruing to the capital class. And one of the reasons is the drastic cut in tax rates. And both Gabriel Zucman and Thomas Piketty have shown this, that when tax rates declined as precipitously as they did, corporations said, okay, now we're going to be incentivized to give more of that money to the CEOs, more of that money to the shareholders, and less of that money to workers. When the tax rates were higher, there wasn't that much value in giving that extra money to the CEOs and capital holders, and so you could have corporations giving more money to workers. So the imbalance is startling, and it is. I make this argument all the time in Silicon Valley. I said, you can't be an island. There is going to be anger. People don't resent, and that's your wealth generation, your innovation. They resent that they're not part of it. And I often say, if the guy who represents more billionaires than anyone on the planet can be for taxing them more, I don't understand how this is a hard vote for 434 other members of Congress.
Nice. Well, you did mention there, you talked about wealth accruing to capitalist class, and given who I am and what show you're on, I really can't not ask you about one of the votes that I do actually really disagree with you about, and I kind of found the most baffling. Right, so a couple of years ago, the House passed a resolution condemning socialism. I wrote about it at the time for the Daily Beast. I think we have that graphic, Jake. So the resolution starts by claiming that, quote, socialist ideology necessitates a concentration of power that has time and time again collapsed into communist regimes, totalitarian rule, and brutal dictatorship. And, we can talk about why I think that's a ridiculous conflation, but here's what I find especially strange about your vote there. In 2020, when the most prominent self-described democratic socialist in the United States ran for president, you were his national campaign co-chair.
Yes,
So
with pride.
what am I missing here, Congressman?
Well, I think that what Bernie is a social democrat. What Bernie is a believer that you should have a universal safety net. Everyone should have health care, Medicare for all, free public college, child care, early childhood education, that there should be fair taxes on wealth to be able to create this kind of society. That is what is just, and that's also an investment in our human capital. That's very different than the belief that the government should control the means of production, that the government should literally run Apple and run U.S. Steel and run companies, which is what I take socialism to mean. Now, I will grant you that there was probably outrageous language in that resolution, but the core point is that I don't believe in the government taking over the means of production. I call myself a progressive capitalist, and I wanted to make that clear in the vote. But I concede that there were probably a parade of horribles, as is often the case, that I wouldn't agree with.
Well, let's just linger on the progressive capitalism for a moment, right? Because obviously there are things that there are things that you do want the government to own, that both the sorts of things that the government already owns or are publicly owned in one fashion or another, depending on the exact sort of setup, from Medicaid to the Postal Service to et cetera, right? And there are things that the government doesn't run or provide right now that you'd like it to. You actually just mentioned a few, right? But if the sort of concern about any sort of more ambitious democratic socialist agenda is, well, in order to have a flourishing economy, you have to have market mechanisms for to provide for certain kinds of things, maybe not healthcare, maybe not education, but perhaps consumer goods. If something like that is the line of thought, right? Then I am curious, because there are more options than just having sort of Soviet style economic planning in every domain, and having what we have. I mean, there's worker cooperatives, for example, right? Like if so, some of those companies that you mentioned, you think that it would be ridiculous for the government to own. If we move towards a form of social organization where workers collectively owned them, or that was more the economic norm, would that be a bad thing? And if so, why?
Well, I am for workers' cooperatives, and I have supported expanding worker cooperatives. I've supported expanding, giving workers stock in companies. I've supported giving workers seats on boards of companies. But I guess I do believe that there's room for the eccentric genius, the eccentric person of not just genius but passion, to say, look, I want to have the freedom to build something, make something, exchange something without necessarily needing a collective buy-in. I mean, and that is the classic story of a small business owner or an entrepreneur. And to me, that is a freedom, a freedom that we should celebrate while making sure that that workers have dignity and voice and a say and appropriate compensation. But I think it would be a mistake to, not just a mistake in terms of economic growth or productivity, but a mistake in terms of human fulfillment, to say that that individuals couldn't have the ability to have thoughts, ideas, plans apart from a majority or a collective that they get to implement. And that's, to me, the defense of why you have free enterprise. But within it, I do think that everyone needs to have the investment in education and healthcare and fair wages.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the economic flourishing part, I can understand that part of the equation, and that sort of constraining like what kind of experimentation with more radical possibilities that you'd be interested in. The part about freedom and fulfillment, I don't. I guess the other thing I would ask about this is it the case that, to your mind, right, if somebody is a genius inventor, and of course we all know that in the real world, technological innovations very, very often are not the result of sort of sole genius innovators. Oftentimes the public sector plays a role and so on. But even where that is the case, right? Like, to the extent that we're worried about the freedom of that person to sort of pursue their economic vision in the way that they want to, and to organize, the firm the way that they want to. I guess I am wondering how you feel about the balance between that and the freedom of the majority of the population, who, when you do have the norm be private individuals owning the means of production, then the majority of the population, realistically, right? Some people can become small business owners, and that's great for them, right? But of course, most businesses fail. It's most people who try to become business owners aren't going to succeed in doing that. Structurally, we can't all be business owners, or else there just wouldn't be enough people, doing the kinds of labor that keep the economy going. So that means most people are going to have to be in a position economically where they're employees who are taking orders all day rather than giving them. And so, do you think there's a concern about freedom there on the other end? And I mean, I know this is like a big sort of philosophical question, but I'm really curious about your views here. Do you think that there's a concern about freedom on that end, right? Sort of freedom from domination that you'd have to at least weigh against what you were talking about earlier?
Sure. And then I've got a
of course,
call. I'm happy to do it longer because I love these kind of conversations. I completely agree with you. I think that there is a balance, and you need workplace democracy of some kind as well. Most of the time we spend is at work. Most people in this country, unfortunately, don't like their work. I've read somewhere that 70% changed their jobs in 2 years. And that's why I do think that workers should have some form of ownership. I mean, giving incentive to give them some kind of equity, some kind of stock. If workers should have some kind of voice in the board.
So you'd be in favor of like co-determination, like you have maybe for firms of a certain size, you have the kinds of things they have even in Germany, where there's some worker representatives who have to be on the board. Yeah,
I've been on Tammy Baldwin's bill to have a third of the board, have worker representation. I think it's in particular important of labor protections and that kind of worker representation in a world of AI, where we need to see what kind of notice someone would get before being laid off, what kind of severance they would get, what kind of voice they would have, that automation isn't used just to eliminate positions, but to augment people. So I think there is a tension, but I think the tension shouldn't go to the point where individuals, for their own passion, whether it's their own art, whether it's their own cupcakes, whether it's their own technology, can't pursue something without the veto of the majority. I mean, I think in a democracy, we want to find a room for self-expression that the market, in my view, does do, though needing checks of equality for workers. And I recognize that there's a tension in those two things.
Well, this is really interesting. I know you've got to go. Do you? Would you have time for one last question?
Yes, let's do one last, and I'd love to continue the conversation on air or off air, because I struggle with this. In fact, in my book, Dignity in the Digital Age, I quote Amartya Sen at length, and he struggles with this issue of what is freedom and the actualization of freedom in a market, and how do you still develop people's capabilities in it. So I think these are deep philosophical questions that don't have easy answers.
Fair enough. Well, I do want to end the conversation. I do want to end it on a slightly more concrete level than where we've been for the last little while. And a question where in policy terms we do completely agree, which is on healthcare, because going back to your answer to my first question, right, about like how have the failures of Democrats, created some of the problem that has sort of created space for a demagogue like Trump to be voted back into office. And you spoke, I think, very forcefully about economic inequality and et cetera. And one instance that is really striking to me is I think about the last three presidential election cycles. And in 2016 and 2020, the debate on the Democratic side was totally dominated by back and forth debate about Bernie's Medicare for All proposal. And even in 2020, I mean, Joe Biden, when he was first running, at least said he would do a push for a public option in healthcare, which I personally think is a poor substitute because you'd still have two-tiered healthcare for the rich and the poor, but would certainly be better than what we have now. But that largely disappeared off the radar. And I remember really being struck during the 2024 election by how little healthcare was even being talked about, like in that election. Maybe if you look at Harris's stump speech or some of the swing state ads, whatever, that there was some stuff on healthcare in there, but by and large, that issue, I mean, as dominating as it had been the last two presidential election cycles, was pretty much off the radar. Not just in the sense that people weren't talking about what you and I want, which is Medicare for all, but like that healthcare in general really wasn't being talked about. And so just on a really practical level, to end on that note, I mean, what do you think we can do to sort of get Medicare for all back into the national conversation in a way that it really hasn't been lately?
Well, I appreciate you having me, and then I do have to run, but look forward to continuing the conversation. I think the two biggest things a society can do is invest in the healthcare and the education of their people. That this is what builds our ability to have a meaningful life. And there's two basic arguments for Medicare for all. One, this is something that's affecting so many people that they're getting into medical debt, that they have someone they know who has an illness and they're not getting the treatment that they need because they're afraid of the cost, that they're not getting to see doctors who are out of network. It's not just those who don't have health insurance. It's so many Americans. And so having health care from the day you're born would relieve so much anxiety and stress of modern existence for so many Americans. It's probably the thing I hear most about in town halls is a fear of what's going to happen to a family member, an elderly person, a child with health care. And it's often the most emotional part of these town halls. And then there's the basic economic argument that it costs a manufacturer, it costs a business $25,000 to hire someone today, in addition to their wages because of the healthcare costs, and that you can't have a strong economy with higher wages for the working class and with jobs not being offshored when you have double the per capita spending on healthcare than any industrialized country. And if you wanted to fix one thing in the American economic system to give more wages to workers and to make it more attractive to set up business in the United States, it would be tackling our total inefficient healthcare system, which is a deadweight cost. And Deaton and Case write about this in their book, Debts of Despair, blaming the healthcare system for the costs that have hollowed out some of manufacturing and led to the decline of the working class. So to me, we have to make the argument that this is both a moral issue, but also an issue fundamentally of contributing to the vast inequality of our system and the failures of the American economic system.
All right. Thank you so much, Congressman Khanna.
Thank you.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns,
all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.